Welcome, Francis, and thank you for accepting this invitation. My name is Valerio del Baglivo, and I'm a visiting curator of UNIDEE, the residency program and the workshop program at Fondazione Pistoletto. We are currently broadcasting a talk of Francis Mkee, Welcome, Francis, of CCA Glasgow. This is the second of a series of presentation. We had last week Charles Esche, and we invite you to connect to our YouTube channel on the 20th of November for a talk by Melanie Buteloup, director of Beton Salon, and on the 21st of November for a talk of Cecilia Widenheim, director of Tensta Consider. We just had the pleasure to conclude a workshop with artist and curator Gianna Graham and Valeria Graziano, and we will host the duo Big Van der Pol and the cooking section. The program was addressed to 8 participants that comes from Europe and beyond, actually, who are all running their own organization, their own spaces. I want to also to say thank for their commitment to the program. Their name are Agil Abdullayev, Gaia Di Lorenzo, Nicolas Ferrara, Giulia Floris, Carlotta Sofia Grassi, Majna Jralla, Yates Norton, and Carolina Ongaro. Francis, I wanted to read your bio before we start. We recognize your significant contribution to the development of curatorial and artistic practice, engaged with experimental approach towards art's role in society. And we are very keen to understand your idea, how you conjugated your museum practice with the notion of open source. But I read your biography, and then I leave you the stage to start speaking, okay? Francis Mkee is director of CCA Glasgow, UK, and also a tutor of the MFA at Glasgow School of Art. He co-curated Scotland at Venice in 2003, Venice Biennale, and he founded Glasgow International Festival of Visual Art the following year. In 2006, he became director of CCA and instituted an open source program. His most recent publications include How to Know What's Really Happening, 2016, Even the Dead Rise Up, 2017, Dark Tales, 2018, and a short story, The Rainbow Brass in the Constituent Museum, 2018. So we are very pleased to actually welcome Francis Mkee.
Oh, hi. You make it sound very coherent. And it's not really very coherent at all. It's completely messy. I didn't even study art. History of medicine, mostly. Fell into art by accident. Ended up curating things by accident. Ended up doing things that everyone else thought might be dangerous to do, like curate the first Venice, Scotland thing. GI, definitely a dangerous thing to do at the time. So these were all kind of accidental poisoned chalices, which I seem to inherit. And 2006 was yet another one. I was invited in as director of GI to look after the space because the director had moved on, while the next exhibition was going to be for Glasgow International. At that point, I realized that the space was bankrupt, basically, and had to think, how are we going to operate in some way? What are we going to do? And basically, the original directions I got from funders was to shut the space. And I think that was primarily my first job, was to shut the space. And pay all the debts, and I would be given money to pay the debts and honor the debts of the institution and then close the doors. So that's how I arrived in the institution. It goes on from there, but I also kind of eventually went back to discover, how did the institution ever get there in the first place? How did it exist? And it was one of 2 institutions. It's an art gallery, an art centre, basically. And so it's got a very mixed program. We have a core visual art program, where we have music, we have Finnish tango, there's some yoga, there's poetry, there's dance. All of these things happen alongside what we do in the core program. And that's very important, I think, in terms of how we consider the program and how we consider the space. It started way back in 1973. This is a kind of a fairy story. It started in 1973 as a psychedelic kind of institution. There was nothing in Glasgow, so artists left Glasgow and went to London. Terrible thing to do, but they were forced to do this because you couldn't stay. There was nowhere to show. There was no studios. There was no facilities in Glasgow. So if you hoped to be a successful artist, you left art school and you left the city as quickly as possible. The Third Eye Centre, as it was called, was founded by Tom McGrath, he had been a recovering heroin addict. He had met an Indian guru who suggested that perhaps a good name for the venue would be Beauty is Light. And the Arts Council rejected that and said, what about the Third Eye Centre? And so they compromised on the Third Eye Centre, perfectly sensible name for an art institution, and it became the Third Eye Centre. The guru also happened to be an ex-Indian weightlifter and who was very careful about physique and exercise and discipline, and suggested they open a vegetarian restaurant in the art centre. In Glasgow now, that's the vegan capital of the UK, but in 1975, this was heresy. Nobody ate vegetables in 1975. So it was quite a strange venue, and the venue was unlike anything before. Previously, you had to be virtually dead in order to get a show somewhere in maybe a national museum. You had to be in your 80s or your 70s. But you couldn't do a show. There was nowhere to have an exhibition. So Third Eye was incredibly casual. You walked in and said, I'd like to do an exhibition. And people said, well, that's not a bad idea. What about next Friday, for instance? So suddenly there was a speed to doing exhibitions that was unheard of, and a casualness. It didn't matter if it was the greatest exhibition in the world. It was about getting through a lot of exhibitions, people being able to show their work, having a dialogue around the work, building a community around work. And that is really what began, I think, a lot of the Glasgow scene. So that was very important roots for the whole thing. They also got the first video camera, and they recorded the first videos in Scotland, and the first art videos and the first not art videos. Being a hippie institution, you could borrow the camera, take it out, film something and bring the camera back. So we now have 150 films from the 1970s of life and the art scene across Glasgow, well, which is unheard of. So that has been quite useful as a source for us when we created an archive and went back to find out who the hell we were and why we were there and why we existed. And it was very clear that we existed because if we didn't exist, there was nowhere to show in the city. And that became the route, obviously, way beyond Third Eye Centre or CCA. Other institutions were formed, other organizations were formed, and now there's an infrastructure across the city that's so successful and so taken for granted that nobody notices that there used to be no infrastructure. It's taken for granted. People complain about it, as they do everywhere. It's not good enough, there's not enough money, it's not this, it's not that. But everyone has forgotten there was no infrastructure originally. And it's that basic infrastructure that changed the city and kept people living in the city and working and talking to each other. So we kind of try to keep that as a route, basically. And 2006, Third Eye Centre went bust in 2001, 2002, 1992, not 2000. And 1991, Third Eye Centre went bust. In 1992, the CCA was formed. It has fascinating roots that we have lost touch with that we'd like to get back. The first chair of the board was a woman. First director was a woman. The first curator was a woman. The first install team was a woman. And the first two shows were by women of colour. And this wasn't a one-off thing. And clearly, we've gone backwards since. But in the current climate where people are talking about these things, this was actually instituted in 1992. So it's not something new, but it is something that has been lost. So possibly it's the men after 1992 that you really have to get. They're the culprits. So that is something we're looking at as well. But these histories have helped us kind of rethink who we are and what we're doing today. So that's been quite useful for us. And in 2006, so I was there paying back debts and buying toilet roll week by week. It was weekly money originally, then became monthly, 3 monthly, 6 monthly. But giving the debts back and paying that off, we realized we had a beautiful space. One reason it went bust was the budget wasn't very big, but the space had almost tripled in size. We now had 4 art galleries. We had a cinema. We had a performance space with a beautiful dance floor that could also act as a cinema. We had hundreds of offices throughout the space as well. We had no less than 2 bars and a restaurant. All of this with almost no money and kind of one curatorial mind, one evil mind, that was meant to fill this entire space with one curatorial vision and no money. So really the answer in the meantime, because we were shutting anyway, was to give the space to other people in the city. Artists in Glasgow traditionally, well, like most cities, have no money. And there's a very, very small commercial scene in Glasgow. There are 3, 4 really good galleries, but they mostly sell abroad. They don't sell within the city. There's not an economic tradition of buying within the city that's of any substance. So the city, people are very poor. Everyone's got another job. You know how it goes. That's the kind of city it is. No one could afford to rent a space, which was happening. You had to rent a space, you rented the cinema, you got the film, you showed the film. This could bankrupt you just doing one film. So we gave the space away. I thought, well, let's just trash the building as we go because we're leaving quite soon. It's all over. Let's just go for it. So we started offering the building to people that we knew. Word got around and more people began to use the building. I still have another life in that I teach in the School of Art and I research in the School of Art. And I was researching open source ideology at the time. This was still early net days. So open source ideology was important. And so was sharing, and so was bootlegging. And I love bootlegging. I still love bootlegging and just stealing things. That's kind of central to my practice, basically. So this idea was wonderful. And I was also obsessed with a band called the Grateful Dead, my own hippie roots. The Grateful Dead, incredibly successful band. They shouldn't have been. They really shouldn't have survived at all. And in the early 70s, they noticed that people were bootlegging their music and stealing it. And they thought, this is terrible. They're stealing it so badly. This really offended them. So they set up special areas and got their own technicians who were really light years ahead of everyone to teach their audience how to bootleg them efficiently and how to set up beautiful sound systems and record them illegally. And they set aside the taper section, which people did this, and hundreds of tapes would be produced of each concert. And the tapes circulated for free among their audience. They were notoriously bad at making albums. Their albums were just dodgy. But as a live band, they were incredible. So their reputation grew and grew through these free tapes and the circulation of the free tapes. The free tapes still exist. They're now on archive.org. But by the mid-80s, this was the highest grossing band in the world, when really they shouldn't have existed or even be allowed to dress the way they dressed by the mid-80s. They were the most successful band through live sales. They were really ahead of their time. But I love that idea of giving the thing away and what you got back in return. And so that was very influential on me, that you could give things back. You didn't have to let money interfere, because money in Glasgow is such a problem. There's not enough of it. There isn't enough funding. There's no commercial money. Private philanthropy just really doesn't exist on any scale for the visual arts. It possibly exists for opera, or preferably in Edinburgh or London. So really for the visual arts, there isn't much else. So sharing the little you have for free seemed the only way forward, and it seemed good with open source ideology. So we called it arrogantly an open source program. And basically it's, you come in and you make a proposal and say, I would like to use the space. And we look at the proposal and almost always we say yes. unless you're definitely a Nazi, unless you kind of, have a theatre program in which you want 3 weeks theatre rehearsal, which we don't have space for, or unless you're doing something very mainstream that could happen anywhere else and that really, no one would want or need. So that was how we set it up. We said, okay, word spread very quickly. As we grew, we began to see that this was a way forward, because suddenly each partner brought their own audience. And I was very influenced by a book that Bill Clinton was very influenced by. I hate to say this, but to win his election, he'd found a book that said, you don't win by having a huge wave of Democrats. You win by having soccer moms who are going to support you. You win by having small businesses like bookshops, tiny, tiny slivers of population. If you add them all together, you get a majority. So he added together hundreds of little slivers to make his majority. And I thought, this is kind of how we're operating with audiences. We have a film that maybe 6 people come to. We have a poetry reading the next night and 8 people come. We have something at the weekend, like a band, and maybe 100 people come, but they're all different audiences and they all turn up. And eventually, sounds weird to say, wrong to say, they cross-fertilize, not physically, but they cross-fertilize in terms of being audiences. And the poetry audience think, I like the band, and the band thinks I like the dance. And so all of those audiences began to turn up and began to cross-fertilize within the space. But actually, it was a conglomeration of many small audiences that we put together. And that gave everyone a chance to do something. And we were very open with the kind of access and saying, yes, you can do it. We tried to keep it to a minimum financially. We would give the space rather than charge. Previously, people had charged maybe even £400 for one night in one room. We would just give the space. So that cost was out. If they needed to use any of our people, we would charge the person at cost. So we wouldn't make a profit from that. We would just charge it the same amount of money if we did it. If they could use their own person, we would help and induct that person so they could do front of house or projection instead of ours, cut down the cost again. They could charge if they wanted. And many, to their credit, didn't charge and don't charge. So there's a kind of free basis moving through the entire program, and that people agreed with that and also felt the same. And we didn't ever talk about that explicitly. It just emerged anyway. So that's how that evolved. And the openness wasn't a problem. The program was good. The first question I always get is about quality. How did you maintain quality when it's this open? And the answer probably is we didn't, but we didn't have to. People maintain their own quality. It's quite a critical city. It's small, it's cheap, it's free. But the artists are quite critical and don't suffer fools gladly most of the time. So if you do something bad, you find out very quickly from your audience and from other people. So people put that pressure on themselves to do something good. And they also, everyone realized quite quickly you could use the name of CCA. If you did something in CCA, it went on your CV. You did a film program, you curated a film program or a festival or a small exhibition in one of the spaces, you got the credit for that, and it was through CCA, their name, as if we had done something, but we hadn't. But the name itself stands as a kind of institutional name. So the fact that I guess we said okay at the start was useful. We kept the visual art program to ourselves, essentially. The downstairs gallery, there are 3 galleries. We do a core exhibition, 6 or 5 exhibitions a year. And we keep the residencies to ourselves and do a core set of residencies. That's a kind of line in the sand where we say at core we are a visual arts organization, but we also manage a hub, and that hub is much faster. Now there's about 300 partners in the hub. We had roughly 1,200 events in the last few years each year. So that's a lot of events. None of those events are us. They're all other people doing events. So it's a vast hub with a small core visual arts program. Within that visual arts program, we try to work out ideas, we think, we kind of try to inject things into the city and even into the kind of partner programs just through its existence and the ideas there. So that's how it evolved. It evolved quite slowly. We gradually began to become more aware of what we were doing and to articulate it more clearly. We realized several things. One, that, and this I actually got as well from, I visited Ramallah, and that was really interesting because in Ramallah, I learned a lot about allies. I was going to visit archives, and on a trip where I got to meet the theatre people, I got to meet the music people, I got to meet the circus people, the dance people, the visual art people. But what I realized is they were all setting up archives, which made it harder to get rid of them in a funny way, that the archive proved that you had existed for quite a long time and you had done something as a kind of institution, a pillar of a culture and a society. And that was useful because we looked so dubious and dodgy, and that we could, and fragile, that we could be swept away at any moment. So actually going back and making an archive for 40 years worth of work began to demonstrate that this was a long-term project, and many famous people and great artists had passed through the institution that even artists working there now didn't realize. So that gave us something, and also from Ramallah, I think, a sense of allies. If you've got 300 organizations working with you, it's harder to get rid of you because there's 300 other organizations you have to get rid of. And they're getting what they're getting there for free, and they appreciate it. And they also begin to have a sense of ownership. We don't own CCA anymore. We look after it, but it's their cinema, it's their performance space, just as much as it's ours. And if we're threatened, they're threatened. And so it's mutual allyship and comradeship to stay together, to work together, to preserve this space for everyone. And that's well recognized, that we're not preserving it for us and for CCA. It's being preserved for everyone, and they're fighting for it just as much as we are. So that sense of ownership, that sense of community, in terms of selfishness as well, like everyone, we're all selfish, but in terms of selfishness, this space is needed within the city for production and for speed of thought. If it's a very formal organization that's very fixed and everything happens very slowly and it takes 2 years for everything, culture begins to just clam up and die. It's like having too many fish and chips. You just die, your veins stop. It's the same with culture. You need to move quickly and you need to move fluidly and fast. And so that is what the CCA holds within it, is that speed and that capability and adaptability, like open source, to adapt a program to anyone's needs. It's that speed of adaptation that is really kind of core to the whole thing. It doesn't mean everything is good. It means sometimes things are just terrible, but there'll be something along later, and the vast amount of stuff, is kind of amazing. So, and people get to grow programs, and people get to become programmers and learn how to curate and to learn how to, grow their own programs. So there's a really organic sense to people making things within the CCA and making things at fast enough speed that there's a cultural dialogue and interaction. It also meant that we can respond to things that we can't. There is no one curator you can get today that will be able to address sexuality, gender, race, disability, access, politics. There isn't one human being in the world who could do all of this as a curator, and we probably wouldn't want to meet them even if we could. They'd be awful. So it's a kind of question of, well, people in different communities and diverse communities know what they want to do and what they want to say, and they have their own voice. What they want is the opportunity to use that voice and amplify that voice, not have it curated by me or somebody else. So the question is about standing back and letting those voices through, that multitude of voices, all of whom know what they're talking about in their own fields and in their own areas and in their own communities, and getting out of the road, basically, much of the time, to let that happen. I studied spiritualism for a while, very badly. I think I was hoping to talk to the dead, but that never happened. I was learning to be a medium. And then about 2 years into this, I kind of, like, very stupidly, I'm a very stupid person, I realized very stupidly that the whole point was you got out of the road. You're a medium, and being a medium, you get your ego out of the road, you get your mind out of the road, and things can flow through. And that never happened with the dead and me, but it did happen kind of with the CCA, that you get out of the road and let these things come through, and you don't get in the way of them, and you support them. And they're all different ideas and contradictory ideas sometimes, but you support each one and you get out of the road and let it happen. That seemed to be part of the open source program as well. That the CCA is a medium and therefore needs to sort of step aside and not have the ego to stay in the road, but to step aside, not take credit, get out of the way. So that's kind of what we do. We realized also as we went along that there's a power dynamic to hosting. It sounds wonderful to say, well, we give all this away. Aren't we wonderful? We give this away, et cetera, et cetera. And there's actually quite a complex power dynamic to this that we're still discovering. You give something away and that's nice, but people also feel obliged within that power dynamic. And there is an obligation in there, and you can't escape that. You can't have some kind of total democratic process that doesn't address or acknowledge that. And that process actually works both ways, because if you're doing something, say you're a live art performer and you decide tonight I'll kill a cat in the performance, well, that's fine. But we also have to take responsibility for that. We've said, yes, you can do this, and you kind of go, we're killing a cat tonight, and you kind of go, that's not going to look too good for us either. There's mutual responsibility into what comes back to us, what we can sanction, or the amount of responsibility that we're seen to be taking for this. So that does work both ways. We're incredibly free on that, except on the basis of killing cats. But there is a kind of a mutual acknowledgement that has to be there, that there is a kind of mutual obligation at some point within this relationship for everyone. And that can be open and that can be discussed. And we have sometimes got to that point of thinking, should you do this? Can we do that? And we discuss it and we talk it through. And mostly we've done it, but it's just talking it through to figure out what's going on and how far things are going, and how much everyone's in control of this and sort of working through it. So that's kind of important as well, that mutual obligation and that power dynamic that keeps shifting backwards and forwards. What else? I think someone described what we do very nicely in, I should almost stop. They said that we're a kind of decentralized space in the middle of what is still quite a neoliberal, organized, growth-orientated city. But within it, we're a pocket of decentralization, which is, I suppose, a bit like a temporary autonomous zone as well. That and they were saying that's great that that can exist within that wider context. We have a public engagement program, which I haven't talked about yet, but I realized the time. The public engagement program grew very gradually. It started with allotments and growing vegetables, back to vegetables. The mortality rate for men at times in Glasgow is 50 to 55 in some areas, because access to fresh food is almost zero. And so it's very, very poor health rate. And I was also interested in copyright and seeds. That notion of bootlegging and who owns what also goes into seeds. And so we thought, why don't we start growing? And so we started a greenhouse actually in one of the free spaces and started growing vegetables. And then we started teaching people how to plant the vegetables, which people loved, just from the sheer physical pleasure of sticking your finger in the soil and sticking in a seed. That was so exciting for people. And then growing something, then you see it grow. So we grew a lot of vegetables. We put them downstairs on tables and said people can take them away, which they did. Sometimes they ran in, grabbed them and ran out as if they were going to be arrested for doing this, because they didn't really believe it. And then they would come back in the autumn and give us food, which was amazing. We didn't even realize it would actually grow. Like, it's not like we know how to garden. We don't. So this was kind of fascinating. And we then moved on to allotments and started working with different communities on trying to make allotments across the city. And that was good and patchy. It was patchy because we had no funding whatsoever. And it was mostly me and some interns. None of us could actually grow anything or wanted to dig. But that's kind of what we did. And then we got money from the Esme Fairbairn Trust, which actually helped to make it a much more structured and secure program with funding, where we could do things knowing that we could keep doing them and have a long-term aim. And it also gave us money vitally to get a curator. So we got a curator for public engagement. We don't have education. We're not sure about education. Education always seems to be second-class citizen compared to curators. So we made a curator of public engagement. That was Viviana Keke, still is. And with the money and her imagination and the program, she took what we had, which is kind of patchy, and made a whole series of new, much more structured programs that have been incredibly successful. One of them is called Cooking Pot, and Cooking Pot is different communities coming together to cook different foods from their communities for other people, and sometimes for decision makers who come along as well, on a regular basis through the city. Another is called Botanic Concrete. Botanic Concrete was about the area we live in, which was about decision making in the area and the role of the citizen making decisions alongside the city. That turned out to be quite important later when Glasgow School of Art burnt down twice, which is right in the middle of that area, and whole streets were evacuated and residents couldn't come back. And even now, the relationship between everyone on that hill and in that area is still quite fraught. So Botanic Concrete gave a really good basis for people talking about the issues within that area and debating that on quite a local level. Other people have come along and tried to borrow the idea for other areas, but we've stuck to that area. So that has been a kind of a key plan that moves alongside everything that's in the space itself. At times, it doesn't even mention art, but it has also done something else, and that previously we were seen as incredibly elitist. When we first went for a grant to do anything with vegetables, they kind of laughed at us and said, "But you're so elitist, who would want to work with you? Why would you even want to do this? You're just not known for doing, would your staff even want to do this?" It was complete disdain. So we had to work at that for a long time, but now people understand that we're kind of committed to this, and we've kind of worked up through Viviana kind of a real sense of recognition across the city for what we're doing and how we're doing it. And the fact, again, like the open source program, we're not leading it, we're listening and facilitating what people want in those communities and helping them, to mentoring them really into doing it themselves. Those two things are now coming together. I'll stop in a moment, but those things are coming together in that we're now looking at how we can look at the curatorial team, and within the curatorial team, bringing in an associate or a fellow, or we don't have the right word yet, who would be linked to those communities and comes in and is mentored through programming exhibitions and events connected to the community, talking back to the community, bringing things from the community into the space. And that is something we're just beginning to work on from next April as well, and trying to figure out how to describe that, work out the logistics of that, the practical application of that. That's just beginning now as well. And that is kind of what we do, I think. I'll better stop for questions.
Thank you, Francis. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Great. There was quite a very interesting introduction. Of course, we start a conversation about the idea of situate art center and museum into a community, and it seems that your example is very much into these discourses. I was very much struck by this idea of mutual alliances, but also this idea that you were talking about, this sense of communal ownership that people have by using the space in Glasgow. Do you guys have question or comment to make? Yes. I pass the microphone, okay?
Okay.
And then when you finish,
maybe just to be in front of the...
You are
good,
on the camera.
good evening. Thank you for the really interesting talk. I just wanted to ask you, because we're operating under this notion called modes of instituting. And I wanted perhaps if you could expand more on when you spoke about the obligations and about these dynamics that might exist within the hub, and what it really means when you mention allyship and comradeship. How does that really translate into the forms of taking ownership over the space, but in the sense of what does that responsibility look like when it's a collective sort of process? especially since you mentioned that it's an autonomous pocket or a decentralized pocket in a neoliberal moving city?
It's the answer is quite banal. um, it's not a very glamorous answer. It translates in practical terms. People ask what they would like to, they tell us what they would like to happen in the space. We adapt the space to what they would like to happen. If we have to negotiate something like smoke, for instance, and fire alarms, whatever, we do that as well, and make the space useful for them, and then change it back to a kind of almost neutral reset point before we set it for the next people who come in. It's that simple, but they expect that, and I would say they kind of respect our technicians who do that. They do that very willingly and very efficiently, and our front of house staff as well. So that's expected, that's delivered, and that gives them a sense that they can come in and say, well, we want this to be over here, and we want this to be here, and we want to have the stage on fire when we kill the cat. And we kind of go, fine. And that's how that works, and that's very simple. It doesn't, we're a very mute society. We don't articulate that much to each other on a daily basis with the partners. They tell us what they want, we do it, they thank us, they leave, but we don't actually articulate it in a very theoretical way on a very regular basis. But it's a kind of it's understood, and people are working to that. The strangest thing for me was funders thought we were crazy for years when we suggested this basis, because we're not making any money, and we're not looking to make money. So that within that neoliberal pocket, we're seen as crazy. Even within the kind of museum pocket, when the fire happened, we were shut for about 5 months, and other people tried to take our events for us and house them, and they found it incredibly difficult, because we start by saying, well, there's no fee, you do it for free, and then you set up the space in this way and this way, and they want it like that, so you do it like that. And other spaces found that very difficult. They have quite a set structure, people do things in a set way, and that's the house rules. Our house rules change about every 2 hours, depending on who's in and who's doing something. And the same with money. They just thought, well, we need to charge for this. We're going, can't charge for this. So in the end, many people didn't move. They just postponed the events and waited until we reopened because of that. But that was the closest we got almost to articulating that. Everyone could see why we worked in a certain way and other people didn't, and the advantages and disadvantages of that. We've never really tried to sit down and articulate too much because it might kill it in a funny way. If we wrote a big book about the whole thing, it would just become a kind of a theory. So it's a working process within that. Yeah, so it has never been instituted, really, using that word. We're kind of wary of that word. We don't really feel like an institution. We feel much too temporary, in a sense, which is one of the great advantages. So we don't feel like an institution in the way that institution implies longevity, regularity. You'll be there after the world burns up. We'll still be there. We won't. We might not be there next week. That is a great advantage to the whole thing. So institutionally, I don't think we really exist in many ways. So I don't know, that doesn't really answer it, but the lack of economics or the different economics is quite a shock to people's systems outside. And they don't get that. They still don't get that. Even after the fire, even after people having to examine it more closely when they try to take it, they still don't understand why we do this crazy thing. So that's one of the problems we face, that it just seems every time we get a new person who comes to see us, like from a funder or from whatever, they say, well, why aren't you charging for this? You could make a fortune if you charge for this and this and this and this. We have one of the largest art buildings in the city. It's a beautiful building. It's really beautiful. A-listed building. We don't charge. And they kind of go, well, this is just crazy, and it may be, but it works. So we're sticking. We will be doomed as well by doing this, but it's better to be doomed and do it than stay alive and do something more boring. So yeah, sorry, that's not still totally not quite an answer, but
Yes, Yates.
Sorry. Thank you very much. That was really, really great to listen. It was interesting to hear you talk about the need for speed and fluidity and a fast-paced approach to doing your programming, because so much of what we've been talking about is the need to slow down. And so how do you couple this idea of speed and fluidity without it being another condition of precarity or exhaustion or confusion? Well, maybe not confusion, just precarity and exhaustion.
yeah, we're good at not being confused. But I understand. I felt we exhausted the staff when we reopened. We ended up doing 8 events a day at one point last January, February, which was far too much. And you could see sometimes you're exhausting people because you're doing too much. I think we also attract people who want to do too much. There is there is a lot of talk about slowing down, but there's also a recognition that you have people who just want to do more and more and more. And we have people who are keen to take it on because an organization comes in and said, I would like to do this next week, and people don't want to say no, so they do. We talk about it a lot. I think we could be slower. I think there's also a way possibly you could be slower but fast. You don't have to kill yourself doing every event, but you can still do a lot of events. It's not impossible to do a lot of events and sort of rotate people and take your time and not go crazy doing them and organize more efficiently. But still, if you do everything really slow, then it's all really slow. And it's kind of conversation can't be that slow. Conversation is fast. And people have thoughts all the time and say things in non sequiturs and things that drift off. It doesn't have to exhaust everyone necessarily, but it has to keep moving, I think. So we do, there are times we do too much. There's precarity to everything we do, but every one of us, I think there's 3 people left who are on full-time jobs. All the rest of us are on 3 days a week. We're never going to have the funding for people to be on 5 days a week. I'm not even sure anybody should anymore. But also, if you're doing the program we're doing, if someone says they want to do a film, they're doing the film, not us. We're opening the space. We don't have to do everything. We just have to get out of the way on a regular basis. So it's not, we don't have to set everything up. We don't have to do everything. You have a set of 300 other organizations coming in and doing that as well. And then they're going home and having a rest for the next 3 weeks before they come back. So there are ways to sort of combine the two, but we are precarious, and I think we have to accept there's not going to be an ideal world where we're not precarious. It would be lovely if there was, but that's not going to happen. So.
Hello. I was wondering, you were talking about how you say yes to almost all the events that are proposed, that apply, and I was wondering what is the role of the School of Art, do you think, in this process? I explain myself better. How do you make sure that there is a certain level of quality and responsibility and responsiveness to the actual issues in this process of opening up the space?
We don't have a relationship with the School of Art, so it has no relationship to the School of Art. We do what they do. They do what they do. I happen to teach, being precarious. I teach in the School of Art as well, but that does not influence or come into what I do in CCA. They're separate, and I keep them separate. So the School of Art has nothing to do with what we do. Yeah.
Sorry, I meant in an indirect way, not directly.
Still not that much. I would love to. No, there's not a great deal of dialogue there. They're very hard to partner with, I have to say. They're a really difficult organization to partner with. And they now have many things to occupy their minds with two fires. So really, their job is to get everything back together again. We work more with graduates, and we do work with graduates or students that need a space to do something. If they want a green screen or they want an empty space to try a performance or voice or music, we give that space. But there isn't a great deal of to and froing in terms of ideas. And I think other venues possibly feel that as well. The school is more isolated in that way, and students tend not to necessarily turn up for things. They will sometimes, but you can't guarantee it, and quite often they won't, or they don't. They'll go to Paris or something, but they won't go to things in Glasgow in the same way. It's odd. You expect a lot of people to come to things, and they don't necessarily come from that arena. They do once they graduate, but when they're studying, not to the same degree. I can't explain that, even though I teach them. I wish I could. Yeah.
Yes. Agi, please.
Hello. I was wondering, like, it's little out of context actually what you were talking about, but in general, because you were in CCA when the Scottish independence referendum happened, so I was wondering, like, how did it change the arts and culture sphere, and like, how did it affect the CCA's relation with the community?
It's interesting. Well,
Wow. Big question.
we all got depressed. Certainly, that was the first reaction, that everyone got depressed. I think the referendum was really interesting because it wasn't about nationalism, and the interesting thing about Scottish nationalism and independence hasn't been the desire for a kind of national identity that's separate. It was actually an amalgam of kind of rainbow coalition of all the progressive movements in Scotland, and there are a lot at the moment. It's a very progressive country, which is very different than England at the moment. I think you can see that through Brexit. And so the desire wasn't for Scottish nationalism necessarily. It was for a country that could define itself very differently than the definitions that England were producing and still are producing even now. But we're much more democratic, much less hierarchical, much less division between rich and poor, much more open in terms of sexuality and gender and race. Migration is huge in Scotland, and it's welcomed. And that's often omitted within the English narrative, where migration is seen, freedom of movement and migration are seen as terrifying things. In Scotland, they're seen as wonderful things. It's an aging population that needs migrants, that welcomes migrants. I know it's not an ideal country. It has a much more positive view of migration than England, for instance, or several European countries. So I think there's something there that was really a coalition of progressive movements, and culture played a very strong part in that. And culture, you could argue that from 1979, when there was another referendum, culture at that point began to lead Scotland and began to redefine what a country could be and what a city could be and what life could be through novels, in particular Alistair Gray, through art, through music. And a lot of the kind of redefinition of what a nation could be has come in Scotland through the arts from 1979 onwards. And that huge renaissance of art and culture in Scotland, I think, has come through that desire for a different kind of country. Not again, as I say, nationalism, just a different kind of way of living in society.
Any other question? I cannot understand you.
When you went to Ramallah, where did you go? Did you, because we have merged, has a space there, which maybe you could.
No, not
No.
Ramallah.
Oh shit! No, not in a Ramallah. Sorry, I'm getting confused. We've had different conversations. But where did you go out of interest?
Um,
Sorry.
well, I've been quite a few times, so I've been to many places. I think the first time was possibly a shoe shop um, for the Liminal Spaces conference that happened in a shoe shop on the edge of the city. Teaching another time in the first year of Ramallah Art College, and then back in different guises and different times throughout quite a long period. Back for Liminal Spaces, I think I was involved in 3 of those conferences as well. And then an odd invitation through IETM, which is a theatre organization. And I was invited to meet people like Jack Persekian, who was talking about National Museum of Contemporary Art at the time, people who were talking about theatre at the time, the circus school, and then went to Jenin as well, to the school there, that kind of art center there. So a whole series of places on a regular basis, sometimes usefully and with a definite aim, and sometimes with no aim whatsoever. And there's a lot of connections through CCA and through the city to Palestine. So it's been a kind of ongoing relationship, I think.
Well, thank you. I wanted to ask you the very last a comment, maybe, which I also asked to Charles. We are here, and as I told you, these participants, they all run spaces. I'm wondering, we can conclude this conversation by asking, what did you learn by the spaces you are hosting, or the organization you're working in the city? Did this mutual relation also give you suggestion and possibility to implement the CCA, or the way you are seeing curating or directing such a space?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a few spaces in particular outside of Scotland. One is Beta Local in Puerto Rico. I would say we learned an awful lot, or I learned an awful lot from Beta Local and how they were organized as an artist-run space. And the other isn't a space at all. It might be Ashkal Alwan in Beirut. And it's something, again, there's a free element. It's not a monetary growth-based economic business in either sense, but also it's how they run and how they sort of try to remove hierarchy in different ways. So in Beta Local, it's difficult to spot a hierarchy. The students are there, but they're also helping to construct the curriculum. And there is no degree at the end, so there's no objective in that sense. It's we're doing this because we need to do it and we need to learn. And this is why we are doing it, rather than the kind of traditional, here's a structure that you must follow because you must get a degree. So we learned a lot from those. And the same, I think it's mostly about hierarchy and how to work within a space. And it's impossible to eliminate, but how to reduce to become more horizontal and vertical. The more vertical you are and the higher it is and the harder it is to get to the director or the manager or the curator, the more painful the space is. And no one's that important in art, really. So it shouldn't, so learning how to reduce that space and reduce the amount of ego in those spaces is kind of, I wish I was better at that, but I think that's what I try to learn from those spaces and keep my ego in check. But I think it is that it's kind of, diffusing responsibility and listening. And some organizations are great at that, and some are terrible, even if they're small. They can be tyrannical. So it's how to learn from that. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think we conclude this session, and I hope you can follow us with the next. But it was a great pleasure to have to host you, but also to finally hear the history of CCA Glasgow. And thank to everybody who was online following us. Thank again, Francis.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.